Brazil's President-elect Lula da Silva says among his top priorities is addressing hunger and poverty. He was declared the winner with 50.9% of the votes, while Jair Bolsonaro garnered 49.1% in the latest election in that country. So this is da Silva's third round in the presidential office after he served terms between 2003 and 2010. In 2018, he was jailed for corruption and money laundering and spent 19 months in prison. So let's get you some analysis on this story. We're joined by international relations expert Dr Dorothée Boulanger, who joins us via our video link this morning. She's a junior research fellow at Jesus College at Oxford University. Dr Boulanger, it's great to have you with us on the program. Very different country Brazil is in 2022 compared to when Lula first became president.
Yes, you're absolutely right. In the last 20 years, Brazil has had mostly an upward trajectory, in part thanks to Lula's policies, actually. Lula was able in the early 2000s to benefit from a very positive economic environment to develop his own social policies that lifted millions of Brazilians out of poverty. And Lula's charisma and popularity also allowed him to make Brazil a very significant player on the international scene.
Yeah, this issue around international cooperation, right? It was one of the announcements that he made in accepting this victory. He says he now plans to open his arms to international cooperation as one of the points on his agenda as incoming president.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think Lula has very rightly seized the fact that Bolsonaro's international, foreign policy was a disaster, and that Bolsonaro's very divisive and provocative image wasn't doing anything for Brazil internationally. And this was aggravated, of course, by, Bolsonaro's policies in favor of deforesting the Amazon. That were met with, international criticism. So you can see that Lula is trying to again, position himself as this great leader who will be able to get Brazil out of its isolation and will be able to renew links in Latin America, but also globally. And I would add to that the fact that so many international leaders almost hurried, right, to congratulate Lula on his victory. Were very prompt to confirm his victory. President Biden of the United States even mentioned, the free and fair elections that had brought Lula to power. So you could tell that the international community is really supporting Lula.
Having said that, Dr. Boulanger, it's not as if Lula's coming into power from a landslide victory, right? It's less than 2 percentage points that got him here.
You're absolutely right, and it is much closer than was initially expected or even hoped for by the Lula camp. And it's interesting, right, this kind of discrepancy between international acclaim, the kind of global relief towards Lula's election, and then you can see that internally in Brazil it is much more complicated than that. 2 months ago, everyone thought that Lula would win after the first round, that it would be a landslide victory, and that Bolsonaro and what he represents would be erased from the Brazilian political landscape. Clearly today what we have seen is the opposite of that. Bolsonaro and his supporters are here to stay, not as president, obviously, anymore, but they have a majority in the parliament, and many very powerful governors are Bolsonaro supporters.
Yeah, I saw a report this morning around some members of the trucking industry protesting on some of the roads in Brazil, protesting in support of Bolsonaro. I mean, what would have, do you think, convinced that 49-point-odd% who wanted him to stay in power to vote that way?
So there are several aspects to that, and it's interesting because it is likely that his voters are so slightly different from the ones that elected him in the first place. What you can see is that Bolsonaro has been extremely efficient in convincing a large part of the Brazilian population that his fight is, really a fight of good against evil. Bolsonaro and his campaign really presented Lula and the PT as devilish creatures who were, whose arrival to power would basically precipitate Brazil in the abyss. So there is a very strong religious overtones to the campaign. And I think for a large part of the Brazilian population, this is something that resonates very profoundly.
Yeah.
I also think that Bolsonaro is also benefiting from, a very strong rejection of Lula and of the PT from a part of Brazilian society. So it is a vote in favor of Bolsonaro's ideas, but it is also, for some, a vote against Lula and what the PT represents.
I mean, it's almost a 50-50 split. Bolsonaro himself has still, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, he's still not conceded defeat.
As far as I know, 2 minutes before being on air, he hadn't said anything. He has stayed silent. And, I was reading the Folha de São Paulo, which is like one of the biggest Brazilian newspapers this morning, who was saying, and I think the allusion is, makes sense here, that Trump hadn't said anything for 7 days. So President Donald Trump had remained silent for 7 days after his defeat against Joe Biden. So I have the feeling that Bolsonaro probably, in the first 24 hours was trying to check with his supporters, his partners, his allies, what would be the best way of proceeding. But obviously this is emboldening his followers, because to some extent it is sending the message that, he might not be accepting the results. And you see these emboldened protesters through, for example, the rock blockades that you were mentioning a few minutes ago.
I mean, is there a fear of perhaps what's to come in the days to follow?
Yes, I think we can talk about fear. I think we can talk about certainly high levels of anxiety in Brazil during the transition period. So, the Brazilian electoral system works a bit like the United States. So the presidential election takes place in the fall, but then Lula will only be internized on the 1st of January. So there is this whole transition phase where the departing administration and the incoming administration are supposed to be collaborating, are supposed to be exchanging information, and the state is supposed to release some funds for the incoming administration to get ready, to get into power. So we will see how this goes at the official level. And then obviously, I think the greatest anxiety in Brazil at the moment is at the social level. Will Bolsonaro's supporters become violent? Will they make the country ungovernable, unmanageable? The campaign itself was already extremely brutal and tense. And so I think the Brazilians are bracing themselves for the upcoming 2 months.
Yeah, long 2 months ahead until the 1st of January. So let's talk about Lula and, what the expectation is from those who voted for him. He's talked about slashing deforestation in the Amazon to zero. Another important point that I started off our conversation with is the issue around poverty and hunger. A third of that country now under threat of severe food insecurity. How do his policies now need to pivot to address these issues?
That's a very important issue, I think. It's a very important point that Lula will need to clarify very early on in his presidency. He has already in his campaign shown that he was trying to gather a very large coalition, and he was trying to, bring in a government and policies that would accommodate the majority of Brazilians, if you want, and that would be representative of Brazilian political forces generally. I actually think that he might keep these two major aspects of his policies forward. I think deforestation and the protection of the Amazon is important. I mean, it's obviously absolutely essential, for the climate and protection of the environment. But also, I think Lula knows that diplomatically it is a very good cause, and it will bring him support from leaders globally. And then, I mean, the alleviation of poverty is, it is true. It really is the DNA of the Workers' Party. And Lula had been incredibly successful during his first mandate to alleviate poverty in Brazil. So he embodies that capacity of the state to lift people out of poverty and to, very concretely improve the life of Brazilians.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly a story on our radar, especially because Jair Bolsonaro has yet to say anything since the announcement that Lula was making this surprise comeback. Dr. Dorothée Boulanger, Thanks so much for your time this morning, giving us some interesting perspective there on what's unfolding in Brazil.